Welcome to the Different Brains Speaker Series and the fourth installment of our webinar series for caregivers. Different Brains is a nonprofit that strives to encourage understanding and acceptance of neurodiversity. Our mission has three pillars. One, to mentor neurodiverse adults and maximize their potential for employment and independence. Two, to increase awareness of neurodiversity by producing media. And three, to foster the new generation of neurodivergent self-advocates. Here at Different Brains, we promote awareness through the production of a variety of media content, including our video web series, blogs, podcasts, and documentaries, all available for free on our website. All of our content is worked on by those in the mentorship program, through which we aid individuals in taking the first step towards achieving their goals and finding their voice. To find more information or to make a tax-deductible donation, please visit our website at differentbrains.org. Before we start, I want to invite everyone to send questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom or by putting questions in the chat box. This webinar will have live closed captioning, which can be controlled using the CC button on your Zoom dashboard. And now I'm going to hand it over to Melodie.
Thank you, Sarai. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. For our fourth, if you've been with us the past couple of weeks, this is our fourth installment of the webinar. I'll start sharing my screen as we, of course, start with our introductions. If you have not been here before and this is your first time meeting me and seeing me, my name is Melodie Plaise. I am a third-year doctoral student at Barry University, and I own a private practice that is driven by a mission to decolonize and destigmatize mental health care. I'll pass it along to my colleague, Carolina.
Thank you, Melodie. My name is Carolina Leon. I'm also a third-year doctoral student at Barry University. Also own a private practice and work mostly with special needs children and their families. I also see couples with any sort of communication issues or anything that they need assistance with. We're excited, as Melodie said, in our fourth webinar and look forward to engaging with everybody. And I'll pass it back to Patty.
Well, thank you, Carolina and Melodie. So my name is Patty Fasano, and I've been working with the children and adults on the autism spectrum in the educational area for over 20 years. And I also have a private practice working with the same population of children and adults on the autism spectrum. I, along with Melodie and Carolina, is in a third-year doctoral student at Barry University, and I am a caregiver. I work, I'm with my mother all the time, and it is a lot of work, but it's fun, and I would never give it up. So back to Melodie.
Thank you, Patty. So I invite everyone to also share who's with us, share your identity, who are you? Let us know who's in the space with us in the chat, and what you'd like to get from this webinar. We invite you to do that as we move into our mindfulness exercise for today. So today, well, if you've been here with us before, if this is your even second or third or actually fourth webinar with us, you know that we usually start with a mindfulness activity. So today we'll be discussing, of course, caregiving and cultural diversity. So we want to really, and I know that can be cultural diversity can be a really heavy topic at times. So I really want to, as we've started all of our webinars in the past with a mindfulness activity, we want to start this one as well with a mindfulness activity. This activity really requires just 30 minutes of your time. 30 seconds, not 30 minutes, 30 seconds or more. It can be as long as you want it to be, right? But for the purpose of tonight, I want to just make it 30 seconds. And it's mindful listening. So in the next 30 seconds, I want you to sit quietly as comfortably as you can, close or lower your eyes if you need to, and really try to list 5 things that you can hear, right? So I can give an example for myself right now. I can hear the AC rumbling, right? That's one thing that I can list, right? So in the next 30 seconds, I invite you to list 5 or as many things as you can hear for in the moment. I love these because you can make them as long or as short as you like. And it really brings you to the here and now. It brings you to the moment. What are some things? What am I hearing in my surroundings right now, right? I would love to invite my co-panelists to jump in and share with me maybe even one thing that you maybe listened for, or maybe altogether, how was this exercise for you?
Thank you, Melody. I really enjoy these exercises because it gives us a time, right? And learning these. But for me, I was sitting here in silence, but hearing the fan, my ceiling fan. I just heard it like going around very quietly, but that's what I was hearing.
Mhm. Yeah, imagine just sitting there and listening to it for longer, right? Like, you know
Exactly.
how soothing that can be, right? Thank you for sharing, Carolina.
So I'm gonna echo that with Patty. It's very hot, so my fan is going very very high. But I wasn't really focusing too much on the fan. I was hearing my daughter and my niece playing and laughing. And so for me, it's very light in the background. But for me, I love that, right? I love hearing when kids are smiling and just playing. And I also wanted to chime in that Nicholas says he's from Different Brains. He's an intern and he's here to show support. So thank you for the support, as
Thank you.
well as Floralba. She mentions great webs, so great webinars. Thank you so much for your support. So we appreciate everyone who chimes in.
Absolutely, thank you. And I also invite you to let us know in the chat too, like, how was this mindfulness exercise for you? What is maybe one thing or one of the 5 things that you listened for, right? Let us know. We'll of course check the chat periodically as we're going through the material. So earlier, as I mentioned, we'll be discussing today caregiving and cultural diversity, right? So on the agenda, of course, we just had our wonderful mindfulness exercise. We'll also briefly discuss, why is this important? Why should we discuss this? Why should this be a topic of conversation, right? I also want to get into caregiver identity. I also want to go beyond race and gender tonight. We'll also talk about formal versus informal caregiving, or both, right? Because it's possible to be both. We'll also talk about culture and caregiving as a whole. Lastly, we'll talk about embracing diversity. We'll give you some reminders, and of course, we'll open it up to the Q&A. So as things come up for you, please feel free to add them in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to add them in the Q&A. And let's get started. All right, so why is this important, right? We know that being culturally aware and sensitive helps avoid cultural misunderstandings, right? And we can also apply that to a caregiving relationship, because it helps avoid those cultural misunderstandings within relationships, within groups, within communities. So within the community of caregiving and caregivers, we also want to be able to continue that in that realm, in that space, right? Secondly, we know that embracing cultural diversity creates harmony in the caregiving space. And lastly, we also know that engaging in conversations about cultural diversity promotes inclusion and belonging for minority caregivers, and just minorities in general, or minority care recipients as well. All right, so I did some research, and I wanted to get some statistics and really see what was out there. And I do want to put a disclaimer out there that this data is from 2015, because this is a survey that is completed every 10 years. So the next one will be in 2025, which is why this is a little outdated. However, this is what we have for now, until 2025 at least, right? So as I was doing the research, I found out that 75% of caregivers identify as women, right? And I don't think that's shocking. We do tend to see a lot of women within the space of caregiving, right? The second thing I looked into was caregiver racial identity, right? So we just spoke about gender identity. I looked into racial identity as well. And the data is showing that 62% of caregivers identify as white, while 13% identify as African American, 17% as Hispanic, and 6% as Asian American. And my co-host and I, we were discussing just like how shocking these statistics were to us. So I would love to invite them to also share just their thoughts about the statistics, while I also want to bring up the question that is on this slide. That's something we'll of course get to, but in the meantime, I do want to give them the floor to discuss this.
No, thank you, Melody. Definitely, one of the things we spoke about amongst the three of us was we wondered how many of or where the statistics sort of came from and how many were underreported, right? So how many caregivers are family members that maybe they don't realize they're caregivers, right? And how maybe that's where you see the underrepresentation or overrepresentation of the caregivers. I think as well as how do you identify beyond a caregiver? For myself, it's a Hispanic female, right? So sort of the same scenario you were talking about earlier, Melody, where gender and culture. So that's sort of what came up for me. I don't know, Patty, if you want to share anything else.
Thank you, Carolina.
Yes. So as a caregiver, thanks, Carolina. As a caregiver, I'm a white. And I don't know, and this is what we spoke about too, if it's paid or unpaid, these statistics, right? So I don't know if I would fall into the 62%, but even as a caregiver for my mother, I also need support. So I always try to get help for me too. So it's not 24/7 around the clock for me. So we are shocked. But like we were saying, it was a few years ago. Things have changed. And it's like, I think, Melody, you were saying it's every 4 years or every 5 years these statistics come out?
Every 10, like the census. So it's just really to collect data on caregivers.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a bit outdated, and I also want to look into how it's a lot less reported within minority populations, right? We see African American, Hispanic, and Asian American they're low, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that they're not out there actually caring for, a care recipient or even a family member, but not really getting paid for it. So there might be minority caregivers out there who, this is my duty. This is something I'm meant to do, and they don't necessarily consider themselves caregiver or don't even label themselves as caregivers, right? So I wanted to bring that up. And regarding the question, I wanted to bring a hypothetical case tonight, just really to connect the dots. So I know, of course, this is a webinar for caregivers. So if you're in this space, you're likely to be a caregiver. And I wanted, as Carolina mentioned, I wanted you to think about how do you identify beyond a caregiver yourself, and that is regarding gender and race, of course. But I also want us to think about this hypothetical case that I have. So let's say, for example, to answer the question, our caregiver is a Black woman who is very religious. We can keep it at that, and we'll continue building off of that throughout this. So keep that in mind. Our hypothetical caregiver is a Black woman who is extremely religious. All right, so I also looked into caregiver affectional identity. And affectional identity really just means, who are you attracted to romantically? Are you a male attracted to female? Are you female attracted to male? Are you male attracted to male? And all of that. So the data really shows that 9% of caregivers identified as LGBTQ, and that stands for either lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender, or queer. now we want to go beyond race, right? Beyond gender, race. We spoke about gender, race, and of course, we just discussed affectional identity, but there are many, many, many other things that one can use to be identified, right? Beyond just your race and your gender. And that can be your ability or disability, right? Again, we spoke about affectional identity already. It could also be your age. It could be your country of origin, culture, even your education, faith, or your religion, your relationship status, social economic status, and even your weight and height are part of what makes your identity as a person, right? So now I want to think about how else does our care recipient identify, right? Or hypothetical care recipient to our Black female religious caregiver. Let's say, for example, we have a white male who identifies as a member of the LGBTQ. Let's say, for example, he identifies as gay, right? So he is a white male who is a care recipient, and he also identifies as gay. And we have a caregiver who is Black, a female, and is very religious. So keeping those three identifiers in mind for each person, and the goal is to think about differences, right? Not just gender differences, race differences, and also affectional identity differences within the caregiving space. So the third identifier, or fourth identifier, that I really want to focus on tonight is formal and informal caregivers, right? So formal caregivers are actual paid providers of care, right? And they can be in a home, they can be in a daycare, and all those other form of care settings. And then we also have informal caregivers, who are unpaid individuals who are just involved in providing that care, right? It can be a family member, a spouse, a family member, a community member, a child, etc. Right? This person is not being compensated to provide that care. So now we're asking, like, is our caregiver a formal or an informal caregiver, right? So she is a Black woman who is extremely religious. Now, is she a formal caregiver or an informal caregiver? For the sake of this case, let's say she's both, right? Not only is she a formal caregiver to the care recipient that we discussed, but she also, at the end of the day, goes home and cares for her elderly mother, right? So she's both. So keeping those in mind, so far we are at a Black, female, religious, formal, and informal caregiver, and we have a white male who identifies as gay as the care recipient. So why are we bringing these up, right? Why the identity of the caregiver? Why the identity of the care recipient, right? And it's really to highlight just cultural differences that may exist in each culture and each individual's lives, right? And I'll pass it to Carolina because of course you discussed this really well. So I'll pass it to you, and then we'll continue the conversation with our caregiver and care recipient.
Thanks, Melody. So like Melody was saying, I invite everybody to think about what are those culture expectations that you have in your own culture. How do they influence or impact caregiving, whether you're formal or an informal caregiver? What are those cultural dynamics or cultural, I guess, experiences that have been ingrained to you? And I invite you to challenge some of those, or maybe some of those cultural norms that you have been accustomed to, right? Or that are very strict to your own culture, and maybe they mesh or do not with caregiving. What are those cultural and generational values and norms that define you or your family? And do they influence or not the way you provide caregiving? As well as, do you provide caregiving from a collectivistic culture? Does that resonate with you, or is it more of an individualistic culture? So just think about how do these these terms that you see on the screen impact or not the way you provide caregiving, right? Or how you see caregiving? Well, are there cultural expectations within your own family of origin that is expected? And I always go back to my grandma just because that's my clear example. My mom is one of four, but she was the caregiver. Now, I don't know that she identified as such. It's just in our culture that is what's expected. One of the women are expected to care for their loved ones. And so it is a very gendered role specific sort of culture. And that's just part of it, right? And so I invite you to challenge that and sort of just acknowledge, do you have any of those sort of cultural norms or expectations within your system? And Patty, I don't know if you want to add anything, or Melody.
Sure. Thank you, Carolina. So for me, I grew up with my grandmother living with us, and my mother took care of my grandmother because my mother was the only child, and my grandmother took care of her mother. So it's been a generational, but culturally, because from, my ancestors are from Italy, and they just, that's what they do. They just take care of their family members. And years ago, they didn't have the homes that, individuals can put their families in. So I grew up knowing that I'm the only girl in our family, that I would be taking care of my mother, and my mother's now 90 years old. So for me, it came in as that was no choice. I just knew, and, and it's okay. I'm okay with this. But I do feel that if I had to put my mother in a home, I kind of, through my culture, would feel guilty, a little bit of guilt. But I enjoy my mother. I just, I know that there's boundaries for it, and I have to, respect that. And my mother, and I do get, have people helping me, but I do think that seeing this slide, it was expected of me. She would have lived with me over my three brothers. So, and that's okay. So go back to you, Carolina.
Thanks, Patty. And I think of as well, back home where I'm from, there is not really, at least when I lived there wasn't this norm of you place people in homes as they get older. The kickback is that, the elderly are sort of, you look up to them. And you see this a lot as well in like, indigenous cultures, like the elderly are really revered and worshipped, and they have all of the wisdom. So, I wonder, and I invite everyone to think about what that would look like, and if it was, if it's something that you can kind of see. And I know there's circumstances for everything, and sometimes a home is the only option. But what would it look like if it wasn't just one person providing the caregiving, but it's a community or a family that's able to provide support for the caregiver and for the care recipient? I'll kick it back to Melody.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Patty. That was like very insightful, very just thought-provoking, really, because as you both were speaking, what I was thinking about is just really I invite you to think about, how does your culture view caregiving, right? Is caregiving maybe the responsibility of someone else? Is caregiving in your culture, is it like an expectation that the child takes care of their parent, right? Or is it something that's even passed, like Patty was saying, is it something that's been passed generationally even, mom took care of grandma, now she's taking care of mom, and it will continue generationally until it is brought to your awareness, right? You don't realize that that's the thing until you bring up the conversation and you actually talk about it. And this is really something that is prevalent in minority populations to begin with, right? To be specific, African American communities, Hispanic communities, Asian American communities, right? There's this expectation to take care of your elderly. You take care of them without pay, without benefits, right? Even when I was doing the research, I found that minority populations are also less likely to use paid care services. Like they're less likely to say no, like we have a cousin who can take care of him, instead of actually finding a professional that they can pay, right? And that's cultural, right? And earlier Carolina was talking about collectivistic culture, right? And collectivistic culture is really it's a collective. Everyone is working for the betterment of us all, right? Anything you do is very I guess like involved, like it's very community or very collectively based, right? So you're always taught to maybe like think of yourself last in a way, because you have to think of the collective, right? Thinking about your elders, thinking about your parents, thinking about them before you think about your own well-being as a caregiver, right? Let's say, for example, culturally, or you come from a culture that is like a marginalized culture, or maybe not even a marginalized culture, that just have these generational values and norms regarding caregiving, and that gets passed on to you. Are you able to say no? Are you able to say, no, I'm not able to take on caring for this person right now, right? Because a lot of the research was saying that culturally, minority populations especially, they don't feel that they can say no, right? And Patty was just talking about feeling guilty. So things like guilt and not being able to say no, all of these things, of course, play a factor in overall well-being and emotional well-being as well. So again, I invite you to think about what are these cultural norms within your family related to caregiving. And you're also feel free to share in the chat or share questions if you feel compelled to. Thank you for this insightful conversation, ladies. All right. So now we really come to this page, right? To this slide, talking about embracing diversity as a whole. And the reason really is, if we're thinking back to our case study, we're thinking back to our minority caregiver who identifies as a black woman who's also very religious and also is a formal and informal caregiver, right? And we also have a minority care recipient as well, because he is white, which holds some privilege. However, his age, right? And he's also a man, so he's a white man. There's privilege there. There's access there. However, when we look into things like age, right? And we're also looking at his situation as a care recipient, having to depend on someone else, right? That puts him in less of a power position. And the fact that he also identifies as gay, right? That puts him in a marginalized population as well. So we have two marginalized individuals, right? But from completely different backgrounds. Now, how do we, like that harmony I spoke about, right? How do we really get that? How do we make that happen? How do we strike that balance? And it's really by being respectful to one another, right? No matter your race, your gender, or how you identify, really just being respectful towards one another, being curious about what others have to say and where they come from and what they do, right? Also, reconsider your stereotypes. Maybe there are thoughts that have been passed on to you from generations to generation, and they're of course stuck with you. So like when you see a certain population or group, you maybe have negative thoughts regarding that group or negative stereotypes that come up for you. And when they do, ask yourself, why can't I just be neutral? We're not asking you to be to completely go up to the other side of the spectrum, but how about just moving just a little bit towards that neutrality, where you're just, okay, I heard these stereotypes, but I know that they don't define a collective, right? Being able to ask those questions. Also being able to educate and empower others. Maybe you're from a minority population. So having these conversations and bringing it up and talking about just cultural diversity, cultural humility, and how it can really help with just like striking that balance, striking that harmony, can be empowering, right? We talked about wanting to of course, support just inclusion and belonging when it comes to minority populations, right? So we want to be able to do that even in the caregiving space. We lastly wanted to say, like, be open-minded about different foods, different traditions, different customs, attires, holidays and celebrations, and even music. I would love, of course, I think Patty, I think you had a pretty good example for this slide. So I'll invite you in to share.
So one of the examples that I actually saw like a week ago is the music part, right, of diversity. There was a caregiver taking care of an older woman, and she's like, they were just sitting there, and she was like beating her music like it was like what would you say? It's like not rock, like a jazz beat, but it was strong. It was like in her generation, because she was much younger than, as a caregiver. She was probably in her late 20s, and she was caring for someone that was probably in their 70s or 80s, and she was just beating and drumming, and it was just so cute to watch, because the person was sitting there like not understanding. It wasn't like that type of music that she was used to. And I really sat back and laughed at it, because not realizing the two probably just didn't sink into the music part, right? They didn't understand. And watching and being on this caregiver webinar, I'm starting to understand and see and witness more people in my area that are caregiving, and just seeing that music part really, it was kind of cute, but realizing as a caregiver, talking to the person you're taking care of, making sure the music, everything, like Melodie was just saying, you have to embrace and understand, the age group, just to understand and be more considerate or be more respectful of the two of you. Yeah, so I thought that was a cute little story. I'll go back to Carolina, because I think you have one too.
Thanks, Patty. No, I think you said it right. Being mindful, and I think that's part of some of the tools that we've shared here. It's
Right.
just being mindful of each other's environment. Again, I go back to my grandma just because that's my biggest takeaway and sort of experience with caregiving. And sometimes food was big for her. There were certain things she liked, some things she didn't. So I think of the example that Melodie gave, where it's two different cultures, and how are the care recipient and the caregiver sort of acclimating to one another's food if the caregiver is cooking. And obviously this is a made up scenario, but it's something to think about, right? What are just something as simple as that? What are the foods that one another enjoys, and how can you find a happy medium? When it comes to traditions and customs, holidays and celebrations, everybody that's here, it's going to look different for everybody, right? So how can you incorporate the care recipient and the caregiver where there's balance for everyone?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, ladies. Did you want to add something else, Patty?
No. I just think that this is really a way for us as caregivers to be mindful, to see these, like the foods, like Carolina was just saying, and understand and just being mindful, and like finding that happy medium, especially with every single one of those. But like, I think of holidays and celebrations, because one of the women that I know that is a caregiver, she works with someone that is Jewish, and she's Catholic. So their traditions, the food, everything's totally different. And she has to be mindful of understanding for both of them to do that happy medium. So yeah, I do like this slide. So thank you for raising our awareness on this.
For sure. Thank you thank you both of you for sharing. And really, I want us to spend some time on this slide, right? Because that's what this whole conversation is about, embracing this diversity. We spoke about the statistics, we spoke about the facts, we spoke about formal versus informal caregiving. Really now is, so what about the case, the case, right? So as I said before, we have a Black female who also identifies as religious as the caregiver. we have a white male who identifies as gay. Let's say, for example, as I said before, our caregiver is extremely religious. Let's say, for example, because of her religion, she holds differing views of affectional identity, which I explained earlier, than does, of course, the care recipient who identifies as gay, right? So how can that cause friction within that relationship, right? And we don't want that, right? So how do we kind of like, again, just like Patty and Carolina were saying, like, how do we meet that like happy medium, right? Like I mentioned earlier, just having like neutral opinions about things, right? We're not necessarily asking you to endorse something that you absolutely do not believe in. However, it's completely okay to also just be neutral, and also have conversations about it, right? In a respectful way, really discussing, just being open and honest about just maybe your thoughts, or maybe questions you might have, right? And we also want to be careful so that these questions don't come across as insults or slights, right? So coming from a place of just genuine curiosity and genuine like respect can be so helpful and can go a long way. So even going back to our case, if we think about the differing views that the care recipient holds from the caregiver, right? We also have to think about that. Maybe he doesn't believe in religion, right? So where does that leave them? And she's, of course, a caregiver. If she's there with him all the time, maybe she needs some time to pray, as she's extremely religious. How does he respond to that? Is he open to that? Does he say, okay, take your time, do your prayer, and then, like, how is he with that? Does he get angry with that? Does he complain about that, right? So it's just like these little things. And with even with the care recipient, with the caregiver, are there things that are coming up for her culturally that may be kind of like causing some bias towards the care recipient, right? Because they're, of course, like as I said before, they're both from marginalized populations. However, they identify completely differently. So I invite everyone to really just take the time and think about how we can embrace diversity in the caregiving space, and hopefully that can continue to trickle to the rest of the population, right? So thank you, ladies, for engaging me in this conversation.
Melody, I have something to add too. This is like a great tool too, like which opened my mind because and raised my awareness, because when I look for other people to help, and take care of someone, that you love, and many of us are on this webinar is caregivers, that when you're looking for someone, it's a great way and a great tool to know all these all these things that you should know when you're, like, let's say, interviewing someone or talking to someone to support you as a caregiver, as for your loved one or something like that. So I think that's important too to say, because these could be brought up in the beginning so you can balance it, and so everything is out there and you would understand through like an interview, like if you're looking for someone to support your loved ones.
And I think you bring up a good point as well, Patty, to know that it's okay to ask for help. And you do not have to do everything alone as a caregiver. I think you've shared that, Patty, that you do that with your mom. There's times where you ask for help. So it's not solely you 24/7. I know when my mom was taking care of my grandma, the same thing. She would ask for help because she also had to work. So she would ask for help, and she had somebody that would come in and help, and culture was a big part of it, right? They had to be somebody that spoke the language, that they could understand one another, so that they could engage in a good relationship, and sometimes food had to do with it. So my grandma was very particular, and if she didn't like something, she would say, and she wouldn't eat it. But the caregivers always accommodated, and they would ask us, what is she like? And it was a back and forth exchange, right? So I think that's the key, to be able to embrace diversity and just really have those open conversations where it's a fit for everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you, ladies. Anything else we want to add before moving on? Okay. I think this brings us here, right, to our reminders. So throughout the series, we've been, of course, giving you tools for your toolkit. And really, this conversation about cultural diversity is a tool for your toolkit, right? Remembering and just being aware of cultural differences and how that may affect the lives of caregivers, care recipients, and people in general can be so extremely helpful in just every space, all spaces. I'm always pushing for just cultural awareness everywhere, not just in the workspace, right? Because I know that's something that is heavily pushed. So yeah, so these are some of the reminders. I'll pass it, of course, to Patty, and she can run us through some of our reminders.
Thank you, Melody. So this is our 4th webinar, and if you have not been with us, or you can always go back onto the Different Brains website and actually watch them and get all the mindfulness activities that we have done, which is really good. You know, hopefully many of you are doing the mindfulness activities, and you can chat in the chat room and open up to see, hey, are you doing it? What's working for you? We would love to hear from you. The one part I love that Melody wrote was having a healthy dose of laughter. I think that's so important because you can become so frustrated, right? It gets to a point like, oh no, something else is coming up, and just stop and just laugh. You know, laughter is a really good medicine, right? Set your boundaries, making sure you're working as much on yourself as you are. We did a tool like a week ago or 2 weeks ago on writing the things down that you've done for the ones that you're taking care of, and what have you done for yourself, to see if that's balancing. So those, that was a really good tool that we were adding to your toolkit. Reclaiming your identity. Don't get so lost in someone else. Always think of yourself too, because you do have to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. It would be very difficult. Like, we have used this strategy prior to this about, you know, when you're on an airplane, and they always say, put the oxygen mask on you before you put it on your child or the one you're taking care of, right? Eating right, taking care of yourself, getting enough sleep, even exercising, taking a walk, you know, and that's not just for you. It's also maybe for the person you're taking care of. Take them for walks, make them eat right, you know, drink your water and stuff like that. But don't ever forget to ask for help if you need it. That's one strategy that we have really been talking about every single week on this webinar, is making sure that it's okay to ask for help, right? So, and like I said, you can go back onto the Different Brains website, actually click and watch these videos again, and use those mindfulness activities, and getting and adding to these tools to help you be okay. So Carolina, did you have anything to say?
No, Patty, I think like you said earlier, just go back on the Different Brains website, you know, reach out to any one of us if you want to practice any of these things, and continue to take care of self so that you can continue to be a caregiver.
Right. And also having these conversations, right? Of course, we talked about setting boundaries, and that includes with identity as well. We talk about reclaiming your identity, not just your identity as a caregiver, but your identity as a person, right? So just all these things that we've been talking about throughout the week, and even throughout this tonight, this webinar, I think these are all like great tools that you can add to your toolkit just for a happier, healthier, and more open and honest relationships and conversations, right? So this really brings us to our Q&A session. So thank you for, of course, taking the time to attend. Please make sure you add your questions in the chat, and we're going to answer them right now. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get into our Q&A. Our first question is, how can you tell if it is appropriate to share aspects of your identity without it crossing boundaries?
I think that's an amazing question. I think really sharing about your identity is something that you should feel comfortable with, right? That's the first part. It's something that you should feel compelled to do. And regarding like the not without crossing boundaries portion, as long as sharing portions of your identity is not coming from a place of malice or a place of bad intent, and really allowing it to come up naturally in conversations is usually the best way, right? Not going around and just advertising and just letting people know like what your identity is. Like, I don't walk around like, you know, like telling people like I'm a Black woman. Like, they can see that I'm a Black woman, and there are also parts of my identity that they can't see, right? However, if the conversation naturally comes up and I feel like I am in a safe and open environment in that moment, and the opportunity comes up for me to share, of course I will share. So I always would suggest just like gauging the relationship you have with the person. Is this an open and honest person? Is this someone who you feel that you can open up to comfortably, right? So just like there are so many different factors when it comes to sharing parts of your identity, and it really has to always come from a place of you're feeling safe, you're feeling comfortable, you're feeling compelled to do it.
Okay, so our next question is, my siblings and I disagree about what's expected of us in terms of caring for our parents when the time comes. Have any suggestions for navigating that?
I, in that situation, I think it would be great to even go through family therapy. And of course, as therapist, I'm always going to suggest therapy and mindfulness, right? And there are things that mindfulness can't do, right? In the moment of disagreements between individuals and within a relationship, within a family, within a system, just having someone who's there as a neutral party to be a mediator, right, can be so helpful. Having someone there who's not a family member, who really has no, I guess, no stakes in what happens or what happens within the family, but just wants to work with you for the betterment of the relationships, I think therapy will always be the answer. So family therapy, or maybe even starting out, you don't have to have the entire family, maybe starting out with 2, 3, or maybe the group with which the disagreement is at, you know, like its highest, the conflict is at its highest. So yes, so family therapy would be my resource, and maybe even like family resolution solutions are also great options. So yeah, look into what's available in your area regarding those.
And I agree with Melody. I think therapy is always going to be helpful. You know, in cases where there's siblings involved, it's tough. It's tough. You know, I saw my mom go through it, and there wasn't always a consensus or an agreement. And sometimes that is the solution. You're gonna have to agree to disagree. But definitely therapy, whether one for the individual or if everybody's willing to come on board. But just like Melody said, it's a non-biased individual who's there to problem solve, to help you come up with your solutions where, you know, everybody feels happy and content, or at least comes to some form of an agreement on caregiving. But I also think, you know, open communication, if possible. We all know sibling dynamics could be difficult and interesting. So it's really being able to have that third party, or, you know, counselor, therapist present to avoid that, and just communicate respectfully without trying to just be the one individual who makes, you know, one all knows all. So Patty, did you want to add anything?
I totally agree with you, ladies. Even myself, I have to, understand, like, yes, when you have 3 other brothers and, and there's nobody will come to an agreement, it is so nice to have that one person that's sitting on the outside looking in and telling you, like, and talking to you about it. And the support that a therapist would give you is really, really good. So I agree with, both these ladies. I think, when you get to that point when it's not, it's like kind of like splitting up the family, it's good to go into like a family therapy and a therapist and seeing it from their eyes, like they're, and having them open it up, and, things that you could not say to, your siblings, you might be able to bring it to the table at that point. So good question and good answer.
Definitely.
Okay, for our last question, we have how can you compromise on these differences, but make sure you aren't taking away from your own needs?
Hmm, that's a very good question. Um, I I want to say that really just going into the conversation, but also honoring your own needs, right? So if the conversation gets to a point where like it's not going either how you want it to go, or it's not going well, or you're feeling uncomfortable and unsafe, it's okay to set a boundary there and say, okay, we're done talking about this. I no longer wish to talk about this, right? So we've been talking to you all about like setting boundaries and all of that. So just keeping these things in mind and really doing things that feel right for you. We've been telling you that from day one. What feels right for you? How do you define this, right? We want your opinion. We want your thoughts. So this is going to, of course, differ individual to individual. However, again, we don't want you to compromise your values, your norms, and who you are as an individual at all. The same way we don't want minority populations or people from different cultures to compromise and their norms or their values, right? So really just coming from an understanding of knowing that, yes, we have cultural differences. However, we're all just here trying to live harmoniously and have a happy life can be like just like, you know, like a reminder in a way, just remembering that yes, we all have our differences, of course. However, we can get along, we can do things together. We don't necessarily have to agree. We're not asking you to agree or do anything you're uncomfortable with, right? And sometimes you might need to get uncomfortable in order to really talk about cultural differences and stuff like that. However, it shouldn't be to a point where you feel like you're compromising who you are at all, right? And I brought up earlier, right? So let's say, for example, you hold a certain value. I said before, we're not asking you to go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum. We're asking you to maybe just move a little bit, just a little nudge, a little closer and closer to maybe just even neutrality, right? Being neutral. About not your own values, but other people's values. Yes, you have your own values, and like we say, like people are entitled to their opinions. People are also entitled to their values. They're also entitled to their customs. They're also entitled to their cultural norms, right? So if we can respect other people's opinions, we should also be able to accept other people's cultural diversity without necessarily feeling like it's taking anything from us as an individual. I don't know if you ladies would like to add anything.
Oh, I think you said it beautifully, Melody. I just want to read because Nicholas put in the chat, mindful compromise, where all parties try to keep in mind their reasons for the disagreeing opinions is probably a very useful thing to keep in mind in that situation. So thank you for your wonderful comment, Nicholas.
Thank you, Nicholas. Yes, and that's for the
Oh, for the sibling situation, yes.
Yes, absolutely.
It's difficult in that particular situation. And I think I agree with Melody. You don't have to lose self to compromise, right? And you know, I can disclose a little bit, you know, in my mom's case with the siblings, there was some cutoff. There, you know, there still is. My grandma's no longer here, but there was a lot of controversy where those open communications were not possible for one reason or another. So unfortunately, there is not always a happy-go-lucky, everybody gets along sort of situation, but you do the best that you possibly can for that care recipient. And like you said, Melody, as long as it is done with good intent and with that person's best interest, then that's, you know, that's what you could hope for.
Thank you, Carolina. What about you, Patty? Anything you'd like to add?
No, I agree with both of you, Carolina. I know because we're experiencing it now, even as I'll disclose in our own family, there's been cutoffs because of this. So it's very difficult when you have siblings that are not agreeing. And, you know, you look at the person that you're taking care of, and that's my, like, the main focus, right? Making sure that you're taking care of yourself, you're asking for help and support, but you're making sure they're safe, you know? So yeah. And
Thank you, Patty. Thank you. That was the last question and last answer. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't say that enough. These webinars wouldn't be possible without your attendance, without your participation. So thank you for attending. And of course, this will be available on the Different Brains website and Different Brains YouTube channel. So you'll be able to revisit this. You'll be able to send it to friends who maybe could not attend and really could use this information. But again, thank you for attending. And that'll be it for us tonight.
Thank you to our amazing presenters, and thank you everyone for attending. Be sure to come back in 1 week for the final installment of our series, and please visit differentbrains.org for more content and resources related to caregiving, as well as many other topics. We will be sharing the links and contact information for everyone in the chat box and on the screen. From everyone here at Different Brains, good night, and thank you again.